past 2 weeks, we've been going through a sermon series on faith. Ben talked about faith that'll grow 2 weeks ago, and then last week he talked about faith that will save. And this week, the title is Faith That Will Go, so that it rhymes. But what it means is faith in action, so thank you. I also invite my friend Eric here so he can laugh at my jokes. So Eric was my best man at my wedding. He's really cool. Please talk to him. Get to know him. Not please. He'll be fine, but you should talk to him because it's a great opportunity to get to know a wonderful person. So let me pray and then we'll jump right in and find out about using our faith. Dear God, thank you for the gift of faith. Thank you for the amazing things you do through us when we are obedient and act on your commands. Help us to have the courage to act on our faith. Amen. So, quiet time. How many people have done 6 quiet times this past week? Yeah. All right. Good. And I mean, I don't want to make it too comparative, but if you did less quiet times too, those ones count also. Every one of those counts. If you did 0 quiet times, then you should work on that. But 1 quiet time, you connected with God, and that's awesome. In last week's sermon, Pastor Ben talked about focusing on God's promises over the problems of the day. He talked about seeking better choices over better circumstances and greater possibilities in the face of harsh realities. Do you feel like you're experiencing any of that as you spend more time with God and get to know him? You don't have to answer out loud, but think about that. I want you to see your quiet time with God as something that is enriching your life and enriching your experience with God and with the Holy Spirit. Because I go throughout my life and I ask myself questions like, why am I not closer to God? Why don't I know the Bible more? Why am I not a stronger Christian? And it's funny because it always comes back to, well, how much do you pray? How much time do you spend with God? How much do you read your Bible? But it's funny because if someone came up to me and said, Gifford, I don't feel close to God. And I said, well, do you read your Bible? Do you do your quiet time devotions? And it sounds like I'm like a Salty tape from the 80s. So, which there is nothing wrong with Salty. He was awesome. Those are back in the good old days. But today, also, before we move on from quiet time, I remember being in college and thinking I was really busy because doing classes takes up a lot of time. And I was having a hard time finding time in my day to spend quiet time. And I remember talking to a friend about it and just saying, I just can't do it. And she was like, have you tried spending 10 minutes? And I think I somehow equated like holiness with the amount of time I spent with God. Like, if you spend 2 hours, then you are ultra holy and you're just extra good. And I think I was afraid to spend 10 minutes, but I just want to, and also if this goes against Ben's advice, please disregard what I'm about to say. But in my experience, 10 minutes is a magic window where it's long enough that you can read an entire passage and actually comprehend it and think about it, and that you can spend about 60 to 120 seconds in prayer, but it's not so long that it's going to impede a busy schedule. If you are working 100-hour weeks, you can still wake up 10 minutes earlier every day. That means out of the 168 hours in your week, you're spending one of those hours with God over the course of the entire week. Actually, maybe 70 minutes with God if it's 7 days a week. I can do math. I don't have a degree in math, but I did do math to get that degree, and it was above first grade math, so I can add. So anyway, I want to encourage you 10 minutes. Like if you just feel like 10 minutes isn't, enough, maybe you can adjust that. But I think 10 minutes is just a really magic time where it's enough time that when you finish, you're like, wow, that did something. That wasn't 30 seconds of reading the Bible frantically before you go to work. And I think it can help. So try it. Today, because we're talking about faith in action, Our theme verse is James chapter 2, verse 14 through 24. I'm using this passage from the New Living Translation because I finally decided that I should branch out from the NIV. Thank you, Ben, because I love the NIV, and it's fine if you read the NIV, and I've read the NIV for years, but I think it's good to diversify your passages just because it gives you fresh perspectives, especially if you've mechanically memorized verses and they almost lose their meaning because you've so memorized them that you don't think of the meaning. Then it's good to pull out the Message sometimes and get that modern phraseology from Mr. Peterson. So this is from the New Living Translation. It says, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, 'Goodbye, have a good day, stay warm and eat well.' But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless." Now, someone may argue, some have faith and others have good deeds. But I say, how can you show your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. You say you have faith, for you believe there is one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? Don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see, his faith and his actions worked together. And I love this sentence. Pay attention to it. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened just as the scriptures say. Abraham believed in God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So you see, we are shown to be right with God by what we do, not by faith alone. So that was kind of a long passage, and not to pull you too much out of it, but I'm going to use two passages that are more than 3 verses today, and I just want to tell you it's okay to have the Bible in a sermon. I really believe that. And so if it is kind of long, I apologize. Sorry, not sorry, because it's the Bible and it's good. So, but I did intentionally include all of that verse because I think every part is critical to what we're talking about today. And there's a lot going on in it. Specifically in verses 14 through 17, it talks about just saying you believe, but not doing anything about it. And I think that when I read that, it reminded me of when I was younger. I think I was like 14 or something. And I read Romans chapter 10, verse 9, which says that if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And I remember reading that and thinking to myself, okay, so you confess with your mouth, all right, Jesus is Lord, and you believe in your heart. Okay, I thought about Jesus being Lord. I'm saved now, And I need to be careful with this because I think, this verse means something, and this verse is true. There is something about saying out loud that Jesus is Lord, and I think that's important. But I think I misread it when I was younger because I was like, okay, so I need to have faithful thoughts towards God, and then some magic happens and I'm saved, but that conflicts with what it says in James, is that you need to act on your faith. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think that it is like troublesome when you read verses like that and you're just like, okay, so it's just like all internal, Nothing outside needs to change. It's all about the inside that matters, And the inside does matter, but the outside matters too. And that's a big part of what I'm going to talk about today. If you were born before 1995, then you probably remember Calvin and Hobbes. Is the famous Bill Watterson comic strip. There it is. It was kind of really good because he based it on John Calvin and Thomas Hobbes, who are both philosophers from the Renaissance. And it kind of delved into deeper issues about human identity and like existential thoughts instead of just slapstick or, I don't know. I don't want to pick on other comic strips because you might like them. But it was good, and I enjoyed it, you know. And there's one Calvin and Hobbes strip that I couldn't find, and I don't know what the copyright laws are about it, so I didn't show it. But they're talking under a tree, and Calvin, who kind of represents like the twisted, demented human inside of all of us, he's saying, you know what, I'm a really good person, and I have good intentions all the time, and they just, you know, sometimes I just mess up, and then everybody thinks I'm a bad person, and I don't know what's wrong with that. And then Hobbes looks at him and says, I think your actions show who you really are inside. And then, you know, Calvin like attacks him or something, you know. And then that's the last panel. But I remember reading that and being like, wow, Bill Watterson, man, like, sounds like you're reading James chapter 2, you know, like that really makes a lot of sense. But if you think about it, like making a disconnect between your faith and your actions, like is kind of silly. And it seems like Bill Watterson got it, that those things are connected, you know, that in a way they're almost like the same thing, you know. What you do shows what you believe, you know. It's not that they're different. Our first fill-in in our sermon outline is you can't just say you have faith, you have to show it with action. And I already said that like 80 times, so I don't have to really repeat that. But that is our first fill-in, and that is a critical thought in this sermon. There's another verse that further unpacks this idea. It's 1 John chapter 4, verses 19 through 21, and this one is in the NIV, and that's okay. We love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God, yet hates his brother or sister, is a liar. For whoever does not love his brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given us this command: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. I'm going to read that first part of that verse one more time. We love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates his brother or sister is a liar. And I think this verse is really powerful because I act hateful towards my brothers and sisters. So do I love God? And according to this verse, I don't. And that's convicting and powerful. I love this verse because it's very straightforward. If you have this, then you also have this. And if you don't have this, then you don't have this either. And so think about that next time you're tempted to be hateful towards other people. You do not love God if you are treating your brothers and sisters with hatred. Plain and simple. And I think this verse also is commenting on that idea that faith and action are very closely entangled with each other. That act of hatred shows what you believe inside of you, you know. And I love using marriage as an example in sermons because it's so easy to connect your mistakes as a human with marriage, and I hope it's okay to talk about it. Emily has been okay so far, and it's usually about me messing up. But you know, like it's funny because when you think of God and loving God and belief in like a marriage context, I feel like it makes a lot of sense to me because there's things like, you know, if I tell Emily that I love her while I'm playing on a PSP, you know, with my boots off on the couch while she's changing a diaper and making me food and cleaning the house, and I'm not helping her, do I love her? And you might doubt my love in that moment. And I would go even so far to say, does it exist? And this is not to say that as a husband you can never take a break, but there is something to be said that if you say something and there is no outward evidence of it, I don't think it's even there, you know? I mean, it's kind of like, football season's upon us. I'm sorry, Emily, I'm going to talk about football for a second. But there's teams that do really well sometimes and teams that don't do really well sometimes. And I saw the Las Vegas Raiders they got like kind of trounced by the Cleveland Browns, which the Cleveland Browns are known as like not a good team. And so I pretend like I was a Raiders fan for a year because Derek Carr was on their team and he's a Fresno State graduate. And then I saw them getting beat by the Cleveland Browns, and I was like, oof, I don't know that guy, you know. The Raiders, who? And so, and so it's like I think a football diehard would say I'm not a Raiders fan because my actions aren't reflecting that. Because a real fan would still like them after they got beat by the Browns. They probably got beat by the Dolphins after that. So, but anyway, like think about that. So also another great way of looking at this like inward outward concept is if you've ever worked with little kids or if you've ever been a kid yourself, just fill in one of the boxes. You'll notice that they have a very poor concept of their own ability and possibly and their identity. I remember being in first grade and telling my friends I could outrun all of them. I was not an athletic kid, but I believed I was better than everybody, and I don't know why. And I remember one of my friends called me out, and he was like, all right, let's race now. And, and I think he started running around the track, and I just didn't even run. I just waited for him to come back, and I was trying to think of what excuse to give him. But the reality was that I was not the fastest runner in that group of kids. And my actions also told them that I wasn't the fastest runner. So even regardless of what I said, I wasn't the fastest runner. I think you get it. So there was a disconnect between the reality and what I thought. Last week, Ben talked about Abraham and Isaac. I'm going to talk about Abraham and Isaac a lot. And he actually brought this up when I was writing this sermon. He was like, hey, you mentioned Abraham and Isaac. And I talked about that, and they already know about that. So you're going to hear the story again, and that's okay. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew that I knew that you'd already talked about Abraham and Isaac, so you didn't think I was not with it. This passage is in Genesis chapter 22, and I'm using this passage just because a lot of faith examples come back to this passage, and also when I was praying about this sermon, this came up in a podcast, and I was just like, yeah, I need to talk about this. And this is a confusing story, and I think it's important to unpack it a lot and discuss it. So this is chapter 2 of Genesis. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. Quick context, if you haven't read Genesis, Abraham is called by God to move to a foreign place, and he listens to God, he has faith. And also Abraham can't have kids, and so God promises that he will make him a great nation. They have so many offspring, so many descendants that they'll outnumber the stars. And so I need you to understand that because now he's asking him to kill his one legitimately born offspring, and it's confusing for him. So early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. I'm guessing fire on a torch. As the 2 of them went together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, But where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham for a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on the earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." So there's a lot going on in this verse. And I think the first thing that struck me when I was reading it is that Abraham doesn't argue with God. And at first I read it and thought, well, maybe they just didn't mention it. But if you think about it, a lot of people argue with God in the Old Testament. Like a shocking number of people who also believe in God and think he's all powerful and right still argue with him, which that doesn't make sense in itself. But, you think about Moses. When God calls Moses, he's like, "I'm not a good public speaker, and I can't do this," And, a handful of other people. I'll tell you later if you want to know. But with Abraham, he doesn't argue. And he goes right along and takes his son and is about to sacrifice him. And that in itself is a really scary thought. But I think that the Abraham not arguing with God shows that he trusts God and shows that he has faith in God. Like if he argued with God, he would not believe that what God asking him was the right thing to do. There's actually a verse in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 19, where it says, Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in this sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. This is when Hebrews is talking about Abraham retrospectively. That's a lot of faith for Abraham to think that Abraham's just like, God is so powerful, he'll just raise my son back from the dead after I kill him, And he still believed that God would keep his promise, which is pretty intense because Abraham is doing something that is acting against God's promise to give him offspring, and Abraham believes that God will work it out somehow. And that is like faith to the point where it seems almost crazy, but when you stop and think about it, you realize that is Abraham trusting God, plain and simple, like to a very extreme extent. And this passage is hard because I have a son, and so I remember reading it and being like, what if God asked me to do that? And it was just like, I would not be able to. Like, that is crazy. And I don't even want to think about it. So what does that say about me and my faith? And so don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying you have to go sacrifice your children to prove your faithfulness to God. But I think we do need to look at Abraham's faith and take it really seriously in this passage and what he's doing. There's a verse in Romans chapter 4, verse 22, where it says, because of Abraham's faith, God counted him as righteous. So what Abraham did was good. The Bible confirms this over and over again, that what Abraham, trusting God and being obedient, was good. And I think if there's one thing we can extract from this verse, and there's several things we'll extract, but I think a big thing is that living by faith will take sacrifice. And that's our next fill-in. A couple of weeks ago, or actually, 2 weeks ago, Pastor Ben, when he talked about faith that will grow, he talked about Samson. And that verse really, his whole talk on Samson hit me really hard because he talked about how Samson was careless with his faith, and he believed that he could float by with the least amount of effort, and that he would be okay. And I think that it's funny because we're tempted to think that constantly in our lives, that we can do as little as possible and still get away with it. If you think about it, if doing the right thing were the path of least resistance, I think everybody would be perfect. So after you realize that, then you're like, okay, I'm probably going to have to do something to do the right thing. And I'm going to have to resist my urges and the society around me and my initial knee-jerk reactions to things. I think that kind of goes without saying. But also what Abraham did is definitely way against your natural inclination. That is a path of a lot of resistance. But I think that is what God calls us to a lot of the time. And so I want to ask you right now, what sacrifice do you think God is calling you to? Because I think that for all of us, there are different sacrifices we need to make for God. And please broaden this definition. This is not a literal killing somebody sacrifice, but there are things that you need to give up to follow God, And some of the things you want are obviously, like you look back after you become a Christian, you're like, yeah, I'm glad I don't try to want that thing or do that thing anymore because now I realize how bad and self-destructive it was. But I think some things that we want that do block us from getting close to God aren't as obvious. When I was making a sermon, I was thinking about sacrifice, and the first story I thought of that was the most obvious, when I was in high school, Lord of the Rings was a really big thing. There's these really cool movies, if you haven't heard of them. They're made by this guy from New Zealand. And I was obsessed with Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. And I read it before. It was cool because my dad is well read. But I remember there was this video game called The Battle for Middle-earth that came out. It was on PC. And I was obsessed with this. I was embarrassingly obsessed with it. And I spent all my time playing this video game. And by the way, to prove that I'm not crazy, I actually tried to buy it later, like last year, and it's still $40 on Amazon, which means it's other people think it's good too, So when a 14-year-old video game is $40, that says a lot about it. So, so it was, I had good taste. It was pretty good. But also I remember praying at one point because I started to feel convicted about it because I was spending all my time, killing orcs and taking over Middle-earth with this video game. And I remember praying about it and being like, God, I don't feel close to you. What is the problem in my life? What is the spiritual logjam that's keeping me from growing right now? And I remember as I was praying, I looked over at this video game sitting on my desk, and I was like, it's The Ring. And I pulled out the CD, and I was like, it even looks like a ring. And I was like, I need to destroy this. And I remember I took it, and I snapped the CD in half. And it was destroyed. And I was just like, that's what I needed to do to get close to God. This thing was taking everything over in my life. And I don't know if you'll have to physically destroy something to get close to God, but sometimes you have to go that far. And I think for me, I realized I couldn't just put this thing in a drawer because I'd just come back to it, and it would keep devouring my time. So, so I want you to think about that. What do you need to give up? What is keeping you from God? What obsession or distraction do you have in your life that is blocking you from growing? And I want you to think about that. And also, I want you to think of it in the sense that your priorities are also going to show, like, what you spend time on is going to show what you're concerned about. And I think this also has a lot to do with your faith and your outward actions. And you need to make God the top priority in your life. What you spend time and money on will quickly show what you're concerned about. There's a verse in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, where it says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And this verse is specifically talking about money and where you spend money, and where you spend money, your heart will be also. But I think you can also pretty easily apply time there. You've heard it said time is money. I think Scrooge McDuck said that. But it's really, like, as an adult, I realize that, like, your time and your money are interlinked pretty closely. You know, when I spend 2 hours to fix my car and then I realize that the repair I did is like a $30 repair and the job I make is, you know, like, you start to do the math and then you're like, okay, it actually would have been better to pay someone else to do this. You know, I link time and money together a lot, and I think a lot of people, you know, that just makes sense. Your fill-in is where you spend your time and money reveals your priorities. And so I want to also ask you, where do you spend your time and your money? Like, what is important to you? And I think the logical conclusion of that thought in this sermon is, do you spend your time and money on God? Because I think that is an act of faith, and that's showing that God is a priority in your life. And I think that's the plain and simple process of that. I promise you that Sierra Pines Church is not paying me to increase the revenue, but tithing is definitely part of this picture. That if you are not tithing, I think that tithing is a great way to, like, make God a priority by spending your money on God, you know? And there's multiple places in the Bible where it talks about 10% as being a tithe, specifically because that is just a good financial balance to have in your life, and you can give more than that. But I think that is something where, like, as you use money, like, towards the cause of God and spreading his church and his gospel, like, that also makes you care about it more in a kind of weird way, and it also just kind of builds up momentum too. Also, you can use your time to give to the church too. A lot of people here are really good about volunteering at this church, which I think is awesome, and this church is built on the backs of volunteers. That sounded a lot like Pharaoh said that, but it's really true. Like, people put up this background on volunteer time. Ernie hands out the pamphlets or the sermon, what do you call those things? Yeah, the outline, the bulletin. Yeah, thank you. And, you know, he does that on volunteer time. So I highly encourage you to give time as well. And time is also sometimes money is less precious than time for you too. And I understand that, especially as you become a parent, like, time just evaporates into thin air a lot of the time. But I highly encourage you have your connection card and your outline, put me in the game, coach, on that, and write a blank check to the church time-wise. And we will find a place for you to serve, especially if this is something you feel convicted about. Hey, feel like I should be doing something for my local church. Awesome. We will find something for you to do. And your talents and your personality, I think we can find something that will match that too. So if you're not a people person, we will not make you do announcements. Don't worry. But I want you to also think about that too. Like, there are ways to use your time and to use your money and to make God a priority in your life using those ways. I also think that a way of loving God practically and having faith manifest itself outwardly is loving your family. And I mentioned that in a sermon that I gave this past year sometime. I think it was in the spring. But I remember I gave a sermon where the punch to the sermon was, you need to love your family more. And the people who are in your life are there for a reason. And I really think this applies to this whole faith equation too, is that if you need to show you have faith outwardly, you do need to show you have faith outwardly. And a way to do that is also to value your family and to make them a priority. I have a 1-year-old that my wife just brought to childcare. Thanks for doing that, Emily. And he is a great 1-year-old, and I love him a lot. Something I remember before I became a parent, I was talking to my parents about parenting, because I am the second oldest of I think we have 11 kids in our family. Yeah, I have a lot of younger brothers and sisters, and I babysat them a lot growing up. And I remember thinking, like, okay, I've pretty much ran the parenting gambit. Like, this is, now when I have kids, it'll just be like the victory lap, like it'll be a slam dunk. And I remember talking to my parents about it and just being like, hey, so like, is there anything different than what I'm doing now? And they were like, well, you don't have a lot of time. Like, you just spend all your time taking care of your kids, and that's what it's going to feel like. And I was like, all right, I don't really know what that means right now. But now I'm a parent, and you're like, oh yeah, like you just, you work and you come home and your kids are there and they need your help with stuff and they need your time. And I think that there's this temptation there as a parent where you're like, my time is mine, and you get very possessive of your time and very miserly, I think, of your time too. And there's that feeling happens to an extent when you get married, initially too. Like, I feel like my theory on parenting right now is that you get married and you realize it's not about you, and then you have kids and then you just really realize it's not about you. And it just kind of focuses and intensifies all of those growing pains that you initially have. And so as a parent, it's tempting to just push my child away and be like, I'm just going to put you in a playpen and I'm going to just go over here. And it's really funny too, because when you think about it, there's things I want to spend my time on that when I stop and think about it, aren't great uses of my time, where you're like, I just really need to watch YouTube right now, But then how I spend my time shows what I care about, it shows my priorities. If I spend 2 hours watching YouTube instead of taking care of my son, that means I care about YouTube more than my son. That's grotesque. That's awful, And please take this with a grain of salt. There are times when you need alone time. And there are times when you need to do something unproductive, and that's okay. There are those moments in your life. I'm talking about the day-to-day, when you map out your time over a week, how many hours was spent on your children, how many hours were spent on your job, kind of thing. As a parent, you're just going to need to spend a lot of time with your kids, and they'll remember that. I remember my dad spending time with me, and that meant a lot. And I look at my son, and it's I have that power now as a parent. I have that power to be generous with my time or to not be generous with that, and there are dire consequences. And so I want to encourage you who are parents, or you who may be parents, or you who have human beings in your life that you have a responsibility to spend time with those people and to invest in them and make them a priority. You should value what God values in your life. And if you value what the world values, you will sorely regret it down the road. Let's see. Also, faith, especially in this Abraham story, I remember reading it and realizing that there was all these different things Abraham is doing by listening to God and sacrificing his son. When Abraham does that, he's not only showing God as a priority, but he's also committing an act of worship towards God. And our next fill-in is faith and sacrifice are acts of worship towards God. And worship is the act of lifting God up and making him look good. And also saying that you believe that what God wants is good. And you are approving of God and supporting, God and acknowledging God. And Abraham does that. Our next fill-in comes immediately after, and faith and sacrifice stem from obedience to God. And I put these right next to each other because it's really hard to separate all those things. I was reading the story, and it's like Abraham's obedient, which worships God. He sacrifices because of his obedience, which is worship. And they're all kind of branches on the same tree, And the more I thought of it, the more I realized that all of these fruits, worship, sacrifice, and obedience, all stem from faith. And I think those are things that will manifest themselves outwardly when you have faith inwardly. When you have faith, you will be obedient. You will sacrifice. You will worship. Those things are almost one and the same, There's a term that I heard a couple of years ago that I thought was super clever. Some people say this, they voted with their feet. And usually they use it to describe how people will do things that show what they really think. You could say that people don't like Wyoming because they moved to other places. They voted with their feet. Wyoming's actually probably pretty good, but it also has the lowest population in the United States. So people vote with their feet. They show what they like by what they do, If you're, I don't know, if you are doing something, and putting on an event, and then you ask your friends to come and say, oh man, I love you, of course I do that, and they don't come, you might have thoughts like, maybe you don't like me, And there is kind of a logical connection there. People do what they believe, And so I want to leave you with that metaphor, the voting with your feet. Like, vote with your feet for God. Like, vote for God with your feet, I guess is what I'm saying. But, what your actions will show your priorities, and what you do will show what you care about and what you believe in. And I hope and pray for you that what you do will show that God is a priority in your life and that you have faith in him. Let that soak in. And I'm going to pray, and then we're going to wrap things up. Bow your heads with me. Dear God, we love you. Show us day by day how to show that we love you through our actions. Remind us of the good things you have done so that we can grow in confidence when we step out in obedience. We love you. Amen.